You are listening to American Wag,
American Wag,
where the mind is respected and the truth is sometimes detected. So it's Eve, and it's still just after 10 o'clock in the morning, so I got an interesting lighting thing going on here. I am in my Raiders NWA colors, wearing my Threeper hat today, and I'm just having a very interesting, chatty morning because I'm feeling a lot of things going through my head, and I'm clear enough, having dealt with some difficulties, so that my creative juices are just flowing. And so I'm just going to kind of freestyle right here. But the thing that I want to talk about is kind of how I came across to liberalism and what I'm thinking about it right now. So first off, just to shut down a lot of nonsense, I am not a Republican. I'm still registered as a Republican, but I'm not interested in voting Republican. And I'm not interested in championing Republicans. And I'm not going to say that I'm conservative, because what has happened over the past decade, as I stopped chasing the talking points and being an advocate for the black right, is that I've started reading psychology, and I started trying to build my literacy in psychology and understand more about that. And part of the reason that I understood there was something wrong is something I've understood for a long time, is that we're just chasing issues to show that we can comprehend them, and we're let's call it Overton window dressing, where we're just saying, oh well, I understand that, and I understand that political idea, and this person doesn't. Now understand, I coming from a technical background, the chatting class is still this. It's not still, but it was this vague, impenetrable place where there were presumably salons where the right people said the right things in the right conversations, cocktail parties, whatever it was, that people whose names are up on the walls of museums talked about to keep themselves company. And I'm remembering those things that came to me, which I personally interpreted at the time as being something that says, hey, you need to be a Republican, or you need to look at this conservative stuff. And it's part of it is just like, I'm just not a random discoverer, but a persistent discoverer in the arts and in politics, and trying to find out what makes sense. Oddly enough, from the Randian implication of that no concept you formulate is valid until you can integrate it without contradiction into the sum of your experience. So my experience takes me from left to right to center to elsewhere outside of the paradigm of left, right, and center. And that's where I am. And so I'm listening to The Portal, which is my favorite podcast with Eric Weinstein. And this episode, he's talking to the Russian woman who has the Red Scare podcast. And right now they're talking about what's wrong with the left. And I'm a person who said MSM more than I said liberal media, and that's because of my personal experience of moving from Los Angeles to Brooklyn, and from reading the LA Times to the New York Times, and then seeing the Post and the Newsweek and the Observer in the context of how they view the West Coast. And I saw that they had it all wrong. And I knew, being a blackified person in Los Angeles, I knew the LA Times had it all wrong. And those were the things that motivated me to be a writer, to be perceptive and articulate, and come up with one of those voices that everybody says we need to have our voices. And I've had something of a following. There's been people who follow my blog, people who were on the nets in the early days, BNet, for example, excuse me, and the Drum. So I'm an old head when it comes to communicating on what I call the Kwaku network, where the black people meet on Wednesday night, and Kwaku means Wednesday. But anyway, the left got it wrong, and the liberal media, the mainstream media morphed into the liberal media, which is easy to say when you're on the right and when you're, trying to communicate certain things. But I remember somewhere around 1991 where I started really getting into Umberto Eco and a guy named Marshall Blonsky from the New School and semiotics in general. And I started to understand, especially in the context of, that Spike Lee, the era of Spike Lee and Public Enemy, where, and George C. Wolfe, and just before Zadie Smith, but part of those guys, Greg Tate, and the guy who wrote Flyboy in the Buttermilk, I forget who that was. And these guys are trying to, along with Quincy Troop, because I hung out in LA before I went to, obviously, with lots of poets, trying to create this new black aesthetic that is going to be a cultural production where we're going to rescue ourselves from half-wit poets on the street corners standing in a cipher. And hip-hop had its direction, and there was a kind of literary hip-hop that had its direction that came through performance poetry, and I jumped into that scene for a short time. But the bottom line was there was a new representation of the authentic black self that needed doing, and I was part of that doing, and I carried it on to online. And so if you could say there's an existential quality, what Robin Harris says, sleeping with your fist balled up, of being in the middle class or upper middle class and still trying to be an authentic, persistent black object, which is my creation called the Boohab, which I did ripping off the Brown Fellinis. I saw a new way to see politics, a new way to see culture, and it was emergent, it was spontaneous, it was generative, and it was a way to be things. And then I wrote all in lowercase when I was doing that kind of postmodern thing. But I understood from Eco and from Blonsky that this is a semiotic swamp, that truth does not have a firm purchase there. And what Eric Weinstein said, there's this, we're in a metaphysical crisis, an epistemological crisis, where there's so many opportunities to say our truth that people are kind of ignorant or willfully ignorant of the truth, because the truth is hard to get to. The truth, basically, people want their truth, and that was what I call flavor, and everybody wanted their flavor. And so when I started endeavor on that endeavor on the internet in the early 90s, I posted something from this guy who was writing about Martin Heidegger, and it was from, oh God, what was it called? The Metaphysics of Virtual Reality. And the problem was that everybody was not going to be a discoverer of truth. They were not going to find the emergent quality of truth or enjoy the journey. Everybody just wanted cheat codes. There was like, how do you be black? Oh, that's it. This sticks it to the man, right? And this has to be, an X. So you had the X hat, and then, the angle will you wear your hat that says something about it? Do you have just one earring or two earrings? And all these symbols become overloaded with supposed meaning for the decolonized mind. And if you swim in those waters and you go upstream to the source and you find out that you weren't born there, then you're a confused ass trout. And I wasn't confused because I never had an existential problem with blackness. I understood that it was a construction from day one because I was born a Negro, and my father was part of the black nationalist movement, black cultural nationalists, and I know what it's like to start to be at the beginning of a black neighborhood community arts center. So I understood that this was a generative, creative kind of thing, and we were inventing a new kind of blackness, which is different than, just stepping into this thing where you're just like, oh, I danced to a George Clinton record. I bought that George Clinton record at the album store, at Freeway Records with Freeway Rick, and we know he's a drug dealer, so it's all that, or whatever the case may be. So I understood that a lot of effort is being poured into and a lot of talent's being poured into this black cultural production thing, and it could happen, and I think it did happen for, the writers that I paid attention to, like Marcus Mabry, like Brent Staples, and certain others that don't pop into mind right now. But that wasn't sustained. And hip-hop artists got more play, and they got more money, and they got more universal, accolades. So my point is drifting off topic, because what I really want to talk about is what kind of person do you have to be to get through all that and say, well, I'm bold enough to be a Republican. I'm bold enough to be an independent. I'm bold enough to be a libertarian. And part of that, within the context of multiculturalism, you had to be this kind of transgressive personality. And I wasn't about being a transgressive personality. I was about getting in where I could fit in, not for the purpose of anything in particular. I wasn't necessarily going to be guided by a movement. I'm going to be informed by it, but not guided by it. So when I went and investigated the right, my idea was, well, how can this be a part of Black Power? How can blacks on the right? And I expected a particular kind of stereotype, I guess it was, kind of an alpha phi alpha black business buppy stereotype. And I found that there were born again evangelist Christians. There was the Christian right part of Black America, and there was the military right part of Black America, and there was, a spectrum of black interests on the right. And that was surprising to me. It really was. Because I was, an investigator on a journey, on a mission to, find out what's up and get those voices, clear and coherent under a set of values. And those are the values that I created under the banner of the Conservative Brotherhood. But at long last, when I got tired of being a black Republican and I got tired of being a black conservative, because there's only so many signals that you can send out that are authentic, as far as that's concerned, because there's not genuine dialogue between left and right, not anymore. That it was like, and I was there. It was after Colin Powell. After Colin Powell stepped out, and at the point when he was the most popular man in America, and people were like, why isn't he running for president? I think that was a moment that was lost. So I said, well, now I understand liberals, because I started off as a liberal, and I called myself progressive. I called myself a progressive black cultural nationalist, if that bucket makes sense. And I did that kind of thing under the Buhabian label, and that was the early web. And the multiculturalist part and the identitarian part grew and grew and grew. And I was always of the sense that there is a class identity that blacks should emphasize over a racial identity. And class has its own problems, but I was already aware of Audre Lorde and Kim Crenshaw as I was doing this. And I was just like, fine, class is going to be the problem. And that was an interpretation of what I was wanting, because I was like, again, not having a black existential crisis, I'm like, I got everything that I need, and as far as my blackness is concerned, except, millions of dollars. And the question is, how am I going to get my millions of dollars? And then I'll be, totally free. I always was off the chain. I was always unleashed, by the age of 30. And that was clear to me. But, all I needed was the next step, which was multi-millions. But I didn't need it because up here, I was clear and I was free. And it was just about, how do you survive in New York City? Well, that's a set of skills that you get. But what happened to the left? What happened to affirmative action when it became diversity? What power of racial intermixing lost currency when we decided we're just counting noses? We're not counting content of character or heart. And what was the difference between the left, liberals, and progressives? And so what I did ultimately, when I got tired of politics altogether, is why do these people feel like they are so morally superior? What is in their politics that makes it feel like it's more than just politics? Like they don't. I was kind of very upfront that I said, hey, look, I want the black right to get some backsheesh from the Republican Party. And I want them, because I quickly discovered that the parties are all about two things, money and votes. And if you can't deliver money and votes, you're just a pretty face. And so all the rhetoric is about getting power, all power to the party, basically. And we had a caricature of limousine liberals that was the same thing, which is as long as you get our representatives elected. And I could see how potential candidates were jousting for position, in that circuit where, you come to meet the money and the leadership. So my questions were really about why does the left behave the way it does? And what is the liberal media doing? And what are they trying to exemplify in their positions? Because they just weren't logical. They weren't consistent. And I think the big thing that clued me into that was the complete lack of humanitarian efforts during the Iraq War. It was the whole left, the whole Democratic Party and liberals just said, we don't care. We just want to be out of there. We don't want to have anything to do with these people at all. You're over there for the wrong reasons. You said WMD. There are no WMDs. And I was like, what about the Marsh Arabs? Don't you care about them? Are you going to set up one charity where you could just talk about that? And that didn't happen. And that was kind of shocking to me because that effort just wasn't there. It was all about delegitimizing the Republicans and the right and supporting the troops, but not supporting the mission or not caring what the mission is, because the mission was war and we're anti-war. And so the whole yes we can boils down to let's get out of here. We can stop this war if we want to. We don't have to accept its premises. We don't have to accept anything coming out of Iraq because we're not going to go there because it's too dangerous. And we're just going to say, let the terrorists win or however you want to say it. Let's just get our asses out of there. And I'm like, how is this morally consistent? Where are the principles of liberalism? So what I ended up finally doing, and probably was the wrong thing to do, but I'd already been tired of Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School as things that people were pitching me before I declared myself right as, well, this is the next step of intellectual. And I go to Waterstone's Books and Boston looking for C. Wright Mills. Duh, I wasn't going to find that. But that's what I get for being outside of the academy. So I ended up reading, George Orwell. And I read The Road to Wigan Pier and one or two of his works. And I see how he starts off thinking about a European socialism and how it has to be British. And it wasn't a pure kind of theoretical socialism. It was, how do you get the people who actually live these lives to think in these ways to shift the politics this way? And there has to be some moral suasion in that. And I just saw that as Orwell became disenchanted with the left, so did I. And I understood the moral reasons for at the bottom of socialism in the Wigan Pierce story. And I think certainly Orwell understood that, you know, non-socialism can provide those same things because socialism didn't have a monopoly on science. And state capitalism, I'm not going to go to state capitalism. But the bottom line was I saw a moral undercut of leftism and progressivism and the classic establishment liberalism just was getting, you know, beat down. There were no more Walter Mondales even, you know. So in the end, I abandoned all politics and moved it up to political philosophy. I was still attracted to the Straussian thing, the Straussian right. I still sort of paid attention to Manhattan Institute, City Journal. I didn't take so many invitations to the Claremont Institute. I still watched Soul and some other people at Hoover. But it was just a whole tiresome kind of thing. It's like, if all that grinds down into Republicans and Democrats, it's not really worth it. Because those guys are just after money and votes. So I have an organic way of being anti-left because aside from the obvious inconsistencies that the right talking points will reveal, at a deeper level, there is only the symbology, there's only the Alinsky practices, there aren't principles that are wedded to the American Constitution that are front and center in this thing. The whole thing's taken over by progressive multiculturalism, which is a hardened multiculturalism, and still going to throw dead cats until you have the whole alphabet people, you know, running everything. And I encountered that online, you know, dealing with, well, why should I listen to you if you're an upper middle class black male? And I'm like, really? Yeah, but we have this poor homosexual Native American, and his perspective is obviously more important than yours. And I'm okay, you know, and I dealt with that. And so, you know, I see fingers on the scale of multiculturalism and this identitarianism and the idea of going back to reparations, and it's all a semiotic swamp to me. The symbols are not consistent with principles, and people are just trying to get power and influence. And I just saw the whole thing, not as corrupt, but as a waste of time that wasn't getting anywhere. And so, I mean, they're even fighting over interpretations of the meaning of scientific research. And that's where it's just getting, you know, completely ridiculous. So I think there are nonpartisan reasons to question the legitimacy of the moral authority of the left, of liberals, and of progressives, but of liberals the least. And I tend to make friends of liberals, establishment liberal or enlightenment liberals like Steven Pinker, who are trying to make their criticisms of the anti-intellectualism of their side of the house, you know, clear. And I think that's what I have genuinely and originally with Quillette, and without getting into the fray. And I think, again, as I've got into psychology, I think both parties and their marketing arms have appropriated psychology to make people think you are a conservative, or you are a liberal, or you are progressive. And those become part of what is that? not intergenerational, but you know what I'm talking about, the Kimberly Crenshaw look at identity and its moral weight in the fabric of society. And it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. People are not getting mentally liberated. They're getting captured at deeper and deeper levels of their identity. It is kind of a rhetorical capture, where if you are not part of the narrative, then you're disempowered by the people who make the narratives happen. And it's only on the narratives that the currents of power are flowing. And people need to be liberated from that. None of that is liberty. And that's the problem. So I look forward to a time where free men and women are not crowded out of the conversation, or crowded out of the cities, or crowded out of the electoral college, or just crowded out, period. And maybe it'll come to this. If there's just 3% of us who are actually living free and dealing with the truth, that could be enough. There's a whole other conversation that I have about the irresponsibility, and by I mean responsiveness, of our current democratic institutions over a nation of 320 million people. It's very hard to disseminate coherent information across all of those regions and states and populations. And if you reduce everything to, what Heterodox Academy and Jonathan Haidt identifies as the 5 axes of intersectionality, then you're dead. You're dead in the water. And I think everybody knows that. And if we can't throw Donald Trumps at it, we can't just throw stuff at it. You have to think about it and maybe deconstruct it. and there are a lot of people who are left out who are smart and know it. And I'm hoping that people of means will not be afraid to show their faces on the streets, and that we don't have this barricade mentality of institutions and truth seekers. Maybe we just have to go out, with our lokes on and say, I got the truth. I'm not showing you my face. No, we can't have a rerun of Anonymous and Occupy. That can't work. So we need people to face the camera and say what they know. So that's what I'm doing. That's all for now. Talk to you later. Thank you for listening to American Wag. Join us again, won't you?